Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. The beginning of England and France and the period of turmoil. Let's talk about why this thing is not going. There we go. Let's rewind a little bit. Okay, if you remember, the feudal lords in the early Middle Ages are the rulers, not necessarily the entire rulers, but there are kings and everything. But the feudal lords have a lot of power before, the Crusades and everything. You got to understand what we're fixing to talk about is roughly mid-Crusades, after Crusades. But before all that, the feudal lords had the most of the power. There were several different sizes of not kingdoms, but of different lords, manors, and everything else. They each had their own courts, their own armies, their own taxes, etc. Most of them did have an overlord or a king, but there's fixing to be struggles between those two powers. Church also had its own laws, had its own punishments, had its own taxes, etc. And there's going to be problems with them too. Imagine that again. Both had as much power as the king, really, literally. In the early Middle Ages, both of those people, the lords in the church, had as much power as a king. Later in the Middle Ages, kings start to move to more power, and that's kind of how England and France start. Just like right there, the foundations of England and France start because these kings are starting to move to get more power. Let's talk about England real quick. Several groups invade England. I'm not going to go over which groups they are, but just know, Vikings and other groups start to invade England. This is just a quick history of it. England is a little different. They have a feudal society, but there is that unity of England. Everybody kind of has this idea that we are England, and even though they're feudal, and even though they're separate, and even though there's all kinds of different feudal lords, they all felt English in a sense. In 1066, King Edward dies, and I can't remember which Edward. And anyway, he dies, and there's a power vacuum, so there's a struggle of who's going to take control. These nobles come together and they choose Harold. Harold's another noble, and they choose him to rule over all the other nobles. So basically he becomes King of England. Here's the problem. William of Normandy in France, he's a French king. He wants the English king. He is the cousin of Edward, and he believes it is his right to take over England. So he wants the throne. So they're going to obviously go to what? Go to war. Okay, so the main battle that they have is the Battle of Hastings, and this battle literally changes the history of England forever. William wins, the French king wins, and claims all the land in England. And, the lords in England lose their land, the French lords gain land, okay? So here's the weird thing. There's still English kings, and I'm not going to try to explain this to you. I mean, I've been studying this for 20 plus years, and I still have difficulty understanding these kings and all these different, monarchies and everything else that's going on in England and France. I mean, I could literally spend 6 months trying to teach y'all, and we'd still just be barely touching it. So just remember that there's still these English kings. Let's talk about Henry of England. Basically, he is an English king and a French vassal. And like I said, I'm not going to try to explain it to you, but just know that he is a king in England, but he's also a vassal of France. So somebody over in France rules over him, yet he still has land in France. Yeah, I know, it's weird. His son is Richard the Lionhearted, and we've kind of talked about him before, and he takes over after Edward or Henry dies. John, who is Richard the Lionheart's brother, after Richard dies, takes over, and he is a complete disaster in England. Complete disaster. He raises the taxes because he needs to finance a bunch of wars against France. He fights with his nobles constantly. His nobles start to revolt. And as a result of the revolt, they create the Magna Carta. Huge document in world history. All right? So make sure you remember that. And here's the Magna Carta. In 1215, it was written. Okay? And you had several nobles writing this. And what it was, the nobles want to protect their rights, especially after Big Bad John was doing such a bad job. They realized that they could, maybe control more of what the king was doing. So the document, here's what it does. It limits the king's power, okay? And this is what it guarantees. It guarantees no taxation without representation, a jury trial, and protection of the law. Very similar. We get a lot of our ideas from this document. A lot of historical law comes from this document. It's the first time ever in history nobles challenge the power of the king. Now, there's been people that have challenged kings, especially going to war and trying to destroy them and everything else, but if you think about it, this is the first time that they revolted. And you can have a revolution without blood, and this is the first time that they revolted against a king ever in history in a law type environment or in a democratic type way. There was no war. France is a little different. There's 30 feudal lords throughout the entire kingdom of France, okay? These feudal lords, and now before I go into Hugh, these feudal lords, they have several small territories. They're all ruled by different lords. The kings in France only hold a small area centered in Paris, and these kings are slowly but surely going to start to try to gain power. All these kings in Paris over the years, they control major trade routes, so they're starting to slowly but surely gain power through trade. A gentleman by the name of Hugh Capet, I say Capet, I'm not French, but he rises to power, and let's talk about him real quick. He starts the Capetian dynasty, okay? And the Capetian dynasty, it's basically the beginning of the French king's power. Okay, Philip II, who is a Capetian king, slowly starts to increase the monarch's power even more. Okay, nobles really have no power in France. They really don't. There's no unity. There's no French unity. They don't feel like any kind of unification or anything. So these nobles are just basically looking out for themselves. It's kind of the opposite of England, what I just said. And obviously, there's going to be church problems, okay? So the main thing you need to get out of what happened in France, it's totally different. The kings start to gain power. The lords lose power. There's no more democracy-type environment. If you go back to England, let's do that real quick. If you go back to England, they created the Magna Carta. There's still democracy-type environment here. And here in France, it's just fixing to be a total monarchy. And like I said at the end right here, church problems. So that leads into the century of turmoil. Okay, and this century of turmoil, let's talk about the church first, okay? Philip the Fourth, sorry, I forgot my Roman numerals. Philip the Fourth is challenged by the Pope, okay? The Pope, it was, I can't remember who it was, but, it was Pope Boniface. Not that you need to know that. But it was Pope Boniface, and they're arguing amongst each other. They're really just arguing amongst each other. But Pope is challenging him. The Pope is saying, I am the Pope. I have power over all kings. Nobody has power over me. And obviously a king is not going to enjoy that, and he's going to want to take that power from the Pope. So what does Philip do? He throws him in prison. He throws the Pope in prison. Yes, the Pope throws him in prison. So what he does, he forces his French cardinals, or he forces a lot of French nobles to elect a French cardinal to become Pope. And he literally moves the church from Italy to France. So you have a new Pope moving to France. You have a new church basically moving to France, which is still Catholic. And you still have the Catholic Church in Italy. So the church is weakened by this because there's two different entities going on, one in Italy and one in France. There's all kinds of things just taking place here. A lot of people, in France say that nothing in Italy is legitimate because we are the ones that have the Pope. And a lot of people in Italy say nothing in France is legitimate because we are the popes, or we are the ones that have the Pope. So Europe takes sides. There's, major Europe takes sides. Almost all of Europe takes sides. In the French corner, there was France, Spain, Cyprus, Burgundy, Savoy, Naples, and Scotland. In Rome's corner, there was Denmark, England, Flanders, the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, Italy, Ireland, Norway, Poland, and Sweden. So there's already, fixing to be, some major issues here. The problem lasts, but eventually they try to solve that problem, and we don't, what this is known as is the Great Western Schism. We don't really need to, know all those different things, how they try to solve it. Just know that it's the Great Western Schism. Another thing that comes about this time is John Wycliffe and John Hus. And what these two gentlemen are doing, they're basically, one's a theology professor or a professor of religion, and I think they're both professors, but they really, really do not like the church. I mean, they love Christianity, don't get me wrong, but they don't like the church because they see the church as owning a lot of land, a lot of treasure, and a lot of, bad things happening within the church. And you got major issues in all of Europe. You have people that are poor, people that are dying, everything else. And yet you have these huge churches being built and these huge extravagant things being done and popes becoming extremely wealthy. So these two gentlemen, basically, here's what they argue. Oh, sorry, I forgot to put it on there, but make sure you remember this. They argue that the Bible is the final authority over all of Christianity. It's not a pope. It is not one man. So make sure that you understand that. And by the way, John Hus was, just a little quick thing, he was burned at the stake. He was arrested, burned at the stake, and I think they burned him twice, and then they spread his ashes in I can't remember what river. And they burned him twice because they didn't want any part of him left. Yeah. All right, the plague. Let's look at the plague real quick. Yummy. Some of these pictures, and that one on the bottom left there. It's still a bacteria that's around, so it's not like it's gone. And there's a modern picture of it, and I'll go over all this stuff over here in a minute. All right, plague is an infectious disease caused by a bacteria. It kills within 2 to 6 days after being infected. Usually, there's a 95% mortality rate. Bubonic is the most common. There's several different, I don't know what you call them in science, but there's several different kinds of plagues, and bubonic is the most common. That's the one that hit Europe, and it's spread by fleas on rats. As you look right here in all this, you got fleas. Fleas jump on the rat, drink the rat's blood, and the rat blood is carrying that bacteria. Okay, what happens is the bacteria starts to multiply in the flea's gut, and it clogs up his gut, so he can't. Right here, it says right there, his gut gets clogged up with bacteria. Then the flea goes and bites the human. He's trying to suck the human's blood. He can't suck the human's blood because his gut is blocked. So he regurgitates that old stuff in his stomach or his gut, mixes with the human blood, and then the human is infected. It's a wonderful process. Not. All right? Let's continue on. The Black Death is the main plague of Europe. All right? Like I said, it's overall called the plague, but it's really called the Black Death, and it was a pandemic. Make sure you look up pandemic because there's going to be a question on an Edpuzzle over it. All right? It was a pandemic. It was almost global, and global in the sense of where everybody is at the time. Nobody knows of America and all that stuff, but it is global. It's all the way from China, all the way to northern Africa, Saudi Arabia, southern parts of Russia, all of Europe, parts of Sweden, England, pretty much global is what I'm saying. And you got to understand, people, this is a horrible thing. People are living in horrible conditions. There's no sanitation. Rome is gone. We've talked about that. There's no running water. There's no bathing. There's no nothing. It's just scum. People living in scum, throwing their filth and their trash and their you-know-what, all their stuff that comes out of their bodies out in the streets. Everybody's just running around and all this. There's nothing. It's just disgusting the way they live. So it's just natural that all this is going to, just multiply. It started with the Mongols, spread through trade. Some say at least 2/3 of all of Europe dies. 2/3. All right? I want you to think about that. That's probably 10 million plus people that have died because of this plague back then. There's several ways people thought of several ways that they could combat it, and here they are. Herbs, flowers, loud noises. If you look at the picture on the right, those are doctors during the plague, and what they would do, they would take those masks and fill them full of herbs, fill them full of flowers, so that all they would smell is that instead of the death and decay. And they also thought it would protect them. They also did loud noises. Church bells would ring 24/7. Cannons would fire off 24/7, thinking loud noises would destroy the plague. And another thing that they had were flagellants. And what flagellants are literally people that would walk around to different towns, and they would beat themselves. They would beat themselves with whips, with flogs, with whips that had spikes on the end of them, just like Jesus was. And they thought that they could travel from town to town, singing hymns, chanting while they were beating themselves, and beat off the plague. And ironically, at first people started flocking to these guys that were beating themselves because they thought that they were going to be healed as well. And the ironic thing, they ended up spreading it even more. Some people blame the Jews, which is another horrible thing, and they literally had a mass Holocaust, okay? There was millions of Jews just murdered because they thought that the Jews started it. And no reason why other than just picking on them. It's a horrible thing that happened. Let's see. Let's talk about the 100 Years' War real quick. It's complicated on how it started. I'm not even going to tell you how it started. Basically, the easiest way to explain it is the French king dies, and the English king wants to claim all his land in France, so they go to war. It was lasted 116 years. Several different kings, several different kingdoms, or kingdoms still of England and France. 3 critical battles happened during this 116-year war: the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Poitiers, and the Battle of Agincourt. I'm not going to ask you anything other than that, what the 3 critical battles were. Longbow. I put longbow on here because we've talked about it before, and literally the longbow almost won the war for England. It really did. It almost won it for England. What happened was, what the longbow did, it literally ended the need for knights, because they could sit there and launch arrow after arrow after arrow after arrow at the knights, and it stopped literally knighthood overnight. Now they had to start fighting different types of techniques and all kinds of different things, what the longbow did. Joan of Arc is this young teenage, she was a teenage French girl, and what she had visions from angels and saints and God himself, and what she said was that God and all these angels told her that she should lead France's army to destroy England. She finally convinced the king to let her do it. I mean, he was out of options. He was trying everything, and finally he just said, "You know what? Let's just try her." She won. She ended up rallying the troops. The French troops loved her. They believed in her. They thought she was holy. She commands the French army, and she ends up defeating England. And ironically, she was also burned at the stake. And you don't need to know, any details on that. But she was burned at the stake. I'm looking through my notes. Hold on. France wins back several key areas of land. She's eventually captured by England. And what they do, they turn her over. They ransom her back to to France. So he doesn't want her back. They say, hey, and let me just try to re-explain this. So they capture her. England captures her. Try to sell her back to France. France doesn't want anything to do with her, so they sell her back to the English. The English put her on trial, and she is tried as a heretic. And guess what? She's found guilty. In one famous part, she's asked if she knew she was in God's grace, and she answers, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." And that's a very famous quote. She never admitted to being a heretic, and she, they didn't know what to do when she answered that. So what they do, they found her guilty. They burn her at the stake. Let's see, I'm reading my notes again. They find her remains, dig her up out of the ashes, burn her 2 more times so that there was nothing but ash, so that she wouldn't have any kind of, relics left, and, no kind of something somebody could grab and have of her and say, hey, this is Joan of Arc, let's rally around it. And then they tossed everything into the river. She was 19 when she was executed. The executioner that did it, started the fire, was very fearful that he was going to be damned in heaven because he thought she was holy. All right, that's it. Be ready to answer the questions. Have a nice day.